Hey team, this is an entry from Robert J. Alexander's History of International Trotskyism. The entry is titled U.S. Trotskyism from the Cannonite Faction to the Workers' Party. This is the first piece I've read about U.S. Trotskyism, which I do not know enough about. The Trotskyist movement in the United States may be said to have had its origins in the Sixth Congress of the Communist International in Moscow in the late summer of 1928. It was there that James P. Cannon first encountered the documents which Trotsky had prepared to justify himself and attack his CPSU opponents, and Cannon was, quote, converted, end quote, on the spot to Trotskyism. That conversion was the acorn from which the U.S. Trotskyist oak grew. Cannon and early U.S. Trotskyism. The Cannonite faction in the Communist Party. James Cannon was a veteran of the factional wars which had characterized the Communist Party USA during its first decade. He had been a member of the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, before World War I and had joined the Socialist Party during the war because of its anti-war position. Cannon soon became active in the left wing of the Socialist Party, which ultimately gave birth to the Communist Party, or several communist parties, which were finally united on instructions received from the fledgling Communist International. Many years later, Max Shachtman wrote of Cannon's role in the Communist Party that, quote, he was known as an excellent orator, a very smooth writer, an exceedingly intelligent and shrewd politician, end quote. He added that, quote, Cannon was a native revolutionist, so to speak, a very able man. He had a very strong and effective feeling for the American working class and the American labor movement for American problems, ... end quote. Cannon's first major factional fight was conducted together with J. Lovestone and Charles Ruthenberg as a leader of the so-called, quote, liquidators, end quote. Their faction favored ending the underground status of the Communist Party at first decreed by the Third International and bringing the party out into the open as a legal organization. At first securing the establishment of a legal, quote, front, end quote, organization, the Workers' Party, late in 1921, they finally took their case to Moscow in the Fourth Congress of the Comintern in 1922, and therewith, according to Cannon, the support of Lenin and Trotsky, whom Cannon met for the first time, they got the endorsement of the International for merging the underground organization with the Workers' Party. Within a year, however, realignments within the party had brought new factions, and this time Cannon was the joint leader with William Z. Foster, the trade unionist who had recently joined the communist ranks of a faction opposed to that led by Ruthenberg and Lovestone. According to Cannon, the Foster-Cannon group, which had its main strength outside New York City, was the, quote, trade union proletarian faction, end quote, and was backed by, quote, the great bulk, practically all of the trade unionists, experienced American workers, militants, and more Americanized foreigners, end quote. Their opponents, on the other hand, according to Cannon, quote, had most of the intellectuals and the less assimilated foreign-born workers. The typical leaders of their faction, including the typical second-line leaders, were city college boys, young intellectuals without experience in the class struggle, end quote. Until the 1925 convention of the Communist Party, the Foster-Cannon faction controlled the party. However, at the convention there arrived a cable from the Comintern ordering that they elect a Politburo on which there were even numbers of the two factions, with a Comintern representative having the casting vote. The Comintern representative in question was Gusev, or Green, a Russian who was frankly aligned with the Ruthenberg-Lovestone group. It was this order which gave rise to a split in the Foster-Cannon faction. Foster wanted to resist the Comintern's instructions, but Cannon was opposed to this, arguing that it was futile to try to fight the Communist International. Thereafter, three factions existed in the party: the Ruthenberg-Lovestone group, the Fosterites, and the Cannonites. Shachtman later indicated the basic reason why Cannon, together with almost all the leaders of the U.S. Communist Party, were totally unwilling to challenge the Comintern's decision. Quote, The authority, not just the formal authority, not just the authority of the first, of the leaders of the International in those days is unimaginable to anyone of our time, ... A comrade like myself, and communist much more prominent in the United States than I was, could not but feel his own terrible inadequacy as compared with these enormous figures, these great leaders of the Russian Revolution. This may sound, probably does, a little lyrical and diathrombic, but it is true. That's how we felt. That's how we felt. End quote. Each of the factions had its power base. The Ruthenberg-Lovestonites had control of the party machinery as such. The Fosterites, quote, occupied the whole territory of trade union work, end quote. The Cannonite stronghold was in the International Labor Defense, which they ran, quote, virtually as we pleased, end quote, according to Cannon. Until the death of Ruthenberg, all four factional leaders were always members of the political committee of the party. Albert Glotzer has noted that by 1928 there was a growing feeling of futility within the Cannon faction about the possibility of gaining control of the party because of consistent support of the Lovestonites by the Comintern. Cannon also commented that, quote, each time we went to Moscow full of confidence that this time we were going to get some help, some support, because we were on the right line, because our proposals were correct, and each time we were disappointed, cruelly disappointed. The Comintern invariably supported the petty bourgeois faction against us, end quote. He added that the Comintern showed that, quote, they wanted to break up this bloc, end quote, of the Foster and Cannon groups against the Lovestonites, quote, and they were especially anxious for some reason or other to break up our group, the Cannon group, end quote. Max Shachtman summed up the position of the Cannon faction by 1928 thus, quote, from its birth, the Cannon faction never had a distinguishing program of its own, never played an independent role, never had a meaningful solution for the factionalism that incessantly corroded the party, but whose roots it did not even begin to understand. If, as a small minority, it nevertheless had the support of a number of excellent militants, it won them not because of any of its virtues in principle or program in general. It had none that anyone, its spokesman included, could ever define, but because of the out-and-out vices that marked the leadership and program of the Foster and Lovestone factions, ... End quote. Max Shachtman. Cannon at the Sixth Congress. It was under these circumstances that Cannon went to the Sixth Congress of the Comintern in August 1928 as part of the U.S. delegation representing his faction. He finally went in spite of the fact that he at first resisted the idea, feeling it was futile. Cannon knew little about the details of the struggle which had been taking place in the Soviet Party, and in this he was typical of the leadership of the Communist Party USA. In his History of U.S. Trotskyism, Cannon noted that routine condemnations of Trotsky and his colleagues by the American Party after their final defeat in the USSR. However, he noted that, quote, looking back at it now, it is an interesting circumstance, which rather foreshadows what was to follow, that I never took part in any of these campaigns. I voted for the stereotyped resolutions, I regret to say, but I never made a single speech or wrote a single article against Trotskyism. That was not because I was a Trotskyist, ... I refused to take part in the campaigns only because I didn't understand the issues, end quote. Cannon did not speak at the Central Committee plenum in February 1928, which formally condemned Trotsky and his followers. At the Sixth Congress, Cannon was assigned to the Program Commission. He noted later that, quote, that turned out to be a bad mistake, putting me on the Program Commission, end quote. It was members of the commission who, by some oversight of the managers of the Congress, received copies of Trotsky's critique, the draft program of the Communist International, a criticism of fundamentals. Cannon, together with Maurice Spector, a member of the Canadian delegation, read the document. Cannon recounted that, quote, we let the caucus meeting and the Congress sessions go to the devil while we read and studied this document. Then I know what I had to do, and so did he. Our doubts had been resolved. It was clear as daylight that Marxist truth was on the side of Trotsky. We made a compact here and then, Spector and I, that we would come back home and begin a struggle under the banner of Trotskyism. End quote. Cannon. Expulsion of the Trotskyists. Cannon succeeded in smuggling a copy of the Trotsky document out of Moscow and getting it home to New York. However, it was not easy to build up a pro-Trotsky faction in the U.S. Communist Party. Trotsky had been condemned as a heretic by the Comintern and by all of its parties, including that of the United States. To support Trotsky was to join him in heresy and to assure one's expulsion from the party. Thus, the process of gaining recruits had to be confined to surreptitiously showing the copy of the Trotsky document to trusted comrades and seeking to win their allegiance to it and to what would now be a frankly pro-Trotsky faction. Cannon recounted that his first convert, once he had returned home, was his lifelong companion, Rose Karsner. The second and third were Max Shachtman and Martin Abern, longtime close associates of Cannon in his caucus. It was Cannon and these three who then set about trying to recruit further converts to their, quote, subversion, end quote. Shachtman had been a leader of the communist youth group, the Young Workers' League, YWL. Shachtman had attended the 5th plenum of the Communist International in 1925 and the 7th plenum in 1927 as the Young Workers' League member of the U.S. Communist Party delegation to those meetings. At the 7th plenum, Grigory Zinoviev was removed as head of the Comintern as a result of the defeat of the united opposition in the struggle within the Soviet Communist Party. There, Shachtman met Vuijo Voyevich, the Yugoslav youth who was a secretary of the Young Communist International, a Zinoviev who tried unsuccessfully to win Shachtman over to support of the united opposition. At the time of the expulsion, Shachtman was editor of Labor Defender, the periodical of the International Labor Defense. Shachtman also was largely responsible for editing the Daily Worker, the party's daily newspaper then published in Chicago. Of Martin Abern, Shachtman wrote that, quote, Abern, as a very young man, was one of the most active leading people in the Socialist Party in Minnesota. Abern came from Minneapolis, from a poor family, made his living as a newsboy for years, was picked up during the war for deportation, ... He was saved at the last minute by a court order procured by his attorney, ... End quote. Abern had been one of the principal communist youth leaders and in 1928 was leader of the party's District 8, Chicago, and a member of the Central Committee. The activities of Cannon, Shachtman, and Abern could not long remain secret within the party. The Fosterites, who had been aligned with the Cannonites against the Lovestone majority, were the first to take fright. After unsuccessfully confronting Cannon and the others with the rumors of their Trotskyism, the Fosterites finally broke up their joint caucus with Cannon and his followers. Finally, the Fosterites, fearful of themselves being tarred with the, quote, Trotskyite, end quote, brush, brought formal charges against Cannon and his associates, and they were put on trial before the Political Committee and Central Control Commission of the CPUSA. Before the trial was over, 100 people attended. At first, Cannon and the others, quote, stonewalled, end quote, not denying their Trotskyism, but challenging in cross-examination the source of the charges made by the Foster people. Quote, finally, end quote, as Cannon later wrote, quote, when we tired of this, and since the report was spreading throughout the party of what was going on, we decided to strike. I read to a hushed and somewhat terrified audience of party functionaries a statement wherein we declared ourselves 100% in support of Trotsky and the Russian opposition on all the principled questions, and announced our determination to fight along that line to the end, end quote. As a consequence, quote, we were expelled by the joint meeting of the Central Control Commission and the Political Committee, end quote. Max Shachtman noted that, quote, the entire Communist Party was astounded, not to say stupefied and even incredulous, at hearing that Cannon had come forward as a supporter of the Russian opposition. The announcement came as a bombshell, not only to opponents but to supporters. There was nothing in the past position or conduct of the faction that offered the slightest indication of the announcement, ... End quote, Max Shachtman. J. Lovestone, who was still Secretary General of the Communist Party, hastened to carry out the purge of Trotsky's followers in the CPUSA. Irving Howe and Louis Kosar have noted that, quote, the viciousness of the campaign which developed against them surpassed anything before known in the American radical movement. Jack Stackel, chief assistant to Lovestone's less savory projects, planned and led a raid upon the private apartments of the Trotskyist leaders, rifled their files. ... Trotskyist newspaper vendors were attacked by party agents and savagely beaten. Cannon's meetings were disrupted and his women comrades publicly called whores. End quote. Sometimes the campaign of the CPUSA leadership proved to be counterproductive. The party chiefs took the position that, quote, those who are not for us are against us, end quote, and every unit of the party was forced to pass resolutions endorsing the action against Cannon and his associates. Anyone who refused to vote in favor of these resolutions without discussion was summarily expelled. As a consequence of this tactic, the newly organized Trotskyists received an important group of recruits in Minneapolis consisting of people who were not originally favorable to Trotsky's ideas but refused to condemn them and the Cannonites without knowing the arguments of Cannon, Shachtman, and Abern, and so were themselves expelled. For many years, the Minneapolis group remained one of the strongest units of the Trotskyist movement in the United States. The Trotskyists were important, I believe, in the 1934 Minneapolis Teamster strike. It's a pretty good documentary about that. If you look for it on YouTube, just type in Minneapolis 1934 strike documentary. It's a good one. In Chicago, too, the tactics of the party leadership won recruits for the new Trotskyist movement. Two of the most important were Albert Glotzer and Arne Swabek. During a meeting of the Foster and Cannon factions in the city to decide what action to take in the face of what had happened to Cannon, Glotzer was approached by Clarence Hathaway, who had been a student at the Lenin School in Moscow sent by the Cannonite faction. Hathaway told Glotzer that he should go along with the expulsion of Cannon because he, Hathaway, knew from his Moscow contacts that J. Lovestone, against whom the Cannonites had fought for so long, would soon be removed from the leadership of the CPUSA, and control would pass into the hands of the Foster Cannon factions. When Glotzer refused to follow Hathaway's advice, he and Swabek were expelled and soon became part of the new Trotskyist organization. Albert Glotzer was one of the principal figures in the communist youth in Chicago. Of Arne Swabek, Shachtman wrote that, quote, he was active in District 8 in Chicago. He was a district organizer. He was very active in the Chicago Federation of Labor as a delegate to the Chicago Federation from the Painters Union. ... He comes from Denmark originally, from the Valley of Swabek, end quote. He had been a secondary leader in the 1919 Seattle General Strike and had been a Cannonite since 1925. The task of organizing a Trotskyist movement in the United States was not an easy one. Cannon, Shachtman, Abern, and several of their other associates had been employees of the Communist Party directly or indirectly, and with their expulsion, their salaries ceased without even back pay. They had no headquarters, no, quote, apparatus, end quote, of any kind. However, within weeks of being expelled, they began to publish a newspaper, The Militant, the first issue of which was dated November 1928, in which began publication of the famous Trotsky documents, as well as announcing the establishment of a new political group. The first printer of The Militant was Joe Cannonite, an ex-member of the IWW, who suggested the name for the paper. He also extended credit. The group got financial help from another unexpected source, including Antoinette Konikow, I believe that's how you say it, or Konikow, Konikow, and a group of Trotsky sympathizers in Boston who had been expelled some time earlier. Max Eastman also gave $200 toward getting the paper started. Expulsion from the Communist Party USA made it much more difficult to approach those remaining in the party. However, Cannon noted that they soon, quote, discovered, end quote, a group of Hungarians who had been expelled shortly before and had developed sympathy for Trotsky's position. He commented that, quote, they certainly looked like an army of 1 million people to us, end quote. There was also a group of Italian followers of Amadeo Bordiga who, quote, worked with us for a while, end quote. Well, that's bananas. There was Bordiga followers in the United States in the 1920s. It's pretty bananas. Most recruiting to the new group necessarily had to be on an individual basis. Cannon noted that, quote, we began an energetic correspondence wherever we knew anybody or whenever we heard of somebody who was interested, we would write him a long letter, end quote. To a modest degree, this recruiting was successful. Cannon noted that, quote, comrades with whom he had been in contact came to our banner in Chicago, Minneapolis, Kansas City, Philadelphia, not big groups as a rule, ... In some places, single individuals took up our fight alone. In New York, we picked up a few here and there individuals, Cleveland, St. Louis, and the minefields of southern Illinois. This was about the range of our organizational contact in the first period, end quote. The Trotskyists were presented a peculiar opportunity to present their views to a considerable number of Communist Party leaders when they asked for and received permission to speak on December 17th to the plenum of the Central Committee of the party to appeal their expulsion. Lovestone permitted this in the hope of snaring some of his Fosterite rivals as, quote, Trotskyite conciliators, end quote. Cannon made a 2-hour speech to the meeting. However, he does not mention how many, if any, recruits they received as a result. Cannon also soon went on a, quote, national tour, end quote. In fact, his itinerary included only some New England cities and a few in the Middle West, but the tour served to put him in personal contact with his followers, consolidate the new local Trotskyist groups, and perhaps to recruit a few new members. In at least a few instances, new adherents were won because of revulsion against the strong-arm tactics used by the Communist Party leadership to try to break up Trotskyist meetings in various cities. In February 1929, on the occasion of the Communist Party's 9th convention, the Trotskyists first presented their program ostensibly as a factional document. Cannon noted that, quote, our platform begins with our declaration of principles on an international scale, our view of the Russian question, our position on the great theoretical questions at the bottom of the fight in the Russian party, the question of socialism in one country. From there, our platform proceeded to national questions, to the trade union questions in the United States, to the detailed problems of party organization, etc., end quote. Finally, by the spring of 1929, the Trotskyists had recruited enough people to undertake their first national convention. It met in Chicago in May with 31 delegates and 17 alternates representing about 100 members. The meeting went off without a hitch in spite of Communist Party threats to break it up. The Trotskyists had brought in a number of coal miners from southern Illinois and had the volunteer services of a group of IWW members to protect the Trotskyists' right to freedom of speech. The Communists did not seek to carry out their threats. As a consequence of this meeting, the first U.S. Trotskyist organization, one of the first such groups anywhere outside the USSR, was established. It was given the title Communist League of America, left opposition of the Communist Party. Cannon noted somewhat grandiloquently that, quote, we went from that conference with the confident assurance that the whole future development of the regenerated communist movement in America up to the time the proletariat takes power and begins organizing the socialist society would trace its origin to the first national conference of the American Trotskyists at Chicago in May 1929, end quote. The ideological position of the Communist League of America. James B. Cannon had sketched the principal elements of the ideological program of the first U.S. Trotskyist organization at the time of its foundation. This program involved 4 basic elements: their attitude on, quote, the Russian question, end quote, their orientation toward organized labor, their standpoint as a, quote, communist opposition, end quote, and their position in trying to recruit new members. There were those in the organization and many more outside it who might have joined the Communist League opposition who wanted to repudiate the Soviet Union. This issue, as Cannon summed it up in, quote, its barest essentials, end quote, was, quote, whether we should continue to support the Soviet state, the Soviet Union, despite the fact that the direction of it had fallen into the hands of a conservative bureaucratic caste, end quote. In answer, Cannon said, quote, we took a firm stand in favor of supporting the Soviet Union, of not overturning it, but of trying to reform it through the instrumentality of the party and the Comintern, end quote. The second issue concerning the Communist League of America's approach to organized labor was particularly provoked by the twist in the Comintern line imposed by Stalin, calling for each national communist party to withdraw its trade union supporters from existing labor movements to establish its own, quote, red, end quote, trade union organizations. Cannon noted that, quote, our first national conference took a firm stand against that policy and declared in favor of operating with the existing labor movement, confining independent unionism to the unorganized field, end quote. The third issue, whether to continue to regard themselves as integral members of the world communist movement formally separated from its ranks through no fault of their own, or to establish a frankly new party completely apart from the Comintern and its national sections, plagued all opposition communist groups during the early 1930s. Although the Trotskyists were to change their position on this issue a few years later, at the time the Communist League opposition was established, it proclaimed itself a communist, quote, opposition, end quote, not a separate party. Cannon explained and defended this position by saying that, quote, the real vanguard of the proletariat consists of those tens of thousands of workers who have been awakened by the Russian Revolution. They are still loyal to the Comintern and to the Communist Party, It is impossible even to get a hearing from these people unless you place yourself on the ground of the party and strive not to destroy but to reform it, demanding readmission to the party with democratic rights, end quote. The meaning of the, quote, oppositionist, end quote, stance of the Trotskyists in this period was summed up well in the militants' report on the Second National Conference of the League. It said that, quote, there was unanimous agreement that our platform is correct, i.e. that our orientation is directly upon the communist movement, of which the Comintern and in the United States the official party is the center, as the only historically progressive force to which our appeal, despite the blunders and mistakes of its bureaucratic leadership, is addressed for the purpose of reestablishing its Marxian foundation, end quote. Cannon summed up the situation saying that, quote, we solved the problem correctly by declaring ourselves a faction of the party and the Comintern. Experience has richly demonstrated the correctness of this decision. The overwhelming majority of our members in the first 5 years of our existence came from the Communist Party. Thus we built the foundations of a regenerated communist movement, end quote. The fourth basic decision taken by the Trotskyists at their inception concerned the question of where they would principally concentrate their attention in terms of seeking recruits. Of course, this issue was closely associated with the question of whether they were an, quote, opposition, end quote, communist group or a completely separate organization. The decision was to concentrate on trying to win over people in the Communist Party and its periphery. The, quote, dog days, end quote. Cannon is authority for the statement that the period between 1929 and 1933 constituted the, quote, dog days, end quote, of Trotskyism in the United States. Not only was the membership small and the financial resources exceedingly limited, but the Communist League opposition suffered from considerable ideological confusion on the part of many who might otherwise have been recruited to its ranks. Shachtman later noted that the Trotskyists in the beginning had few people active in the trade unions. Quote, most of our activity was of a propaganda type, self-education, of classes, of meetings which were in a manner of speaking larger classes, public meetings which were large classes, end quote. Shachtman. With the ascension of Stalin to full power in the Soviet Union and the Comintern, he had executed a drastic, quote, left turn, end quote, both in Soviet policy and in the policies of the International. Within the USSR, Stalin carried out a drastic program of rapid agricultural collectivization and veered the first 5-year plan toward rapid accumulation of heavy capital goods, while at the same time almost completely substituting the planning mechanism for operating a market economy. Within the International, he launched the, quote, third period, end quote, of superheated revolutionary rhetoric combined with extreme isolation of the communist parties from all other groups on the left. To many who might have joined the Trotskyist ranks, it appeared that Stalin was applying the policies which had been advocated by Trotsky. In practical terms, the Trotskyists in the United States and elsewhere found it difficult to differentiate their own positions from those which Stalin was following both in the USSR and abroad. Consequently, the Trotskyists found it difficult to recruit further adherents from communist ranks. Some of those people who did come from the CPUSA came from what came for what the Trotskyists regarded as the wrong reasons. These were, according to Cannon, quote, a lot of dilettantish, petty bourgeois-minded people who couldn't stand any kind of discipline, who had either left the Communist Party or been expelled from it. Many of the newcomers made a fetish of democracy. They desired an organization without any authority or discipline or centralization whatever, end quote. The Trotskyists had some success in this dog days period. They succeeded in establishing, particularly in New York City, a few youth groups which began publication of a newspaper, Young Spartacus, under the editorship of Emanuel Geltman. The Second National Conference of the Communist League adopted a document, quote, Theses on the Youth Question, end quote, which called for bringing these Spartacus youth clubs into a national organization and named a National Youth Committee to act as the provisional executive of that organization. Aside from the work of assuring regular publication of their periodicals, the Trotskyists spent much of their time during these years getting thoroughly acquainted with the ideas of their leader. This is a matter not only of individual study, but of innumerable small meetings to discuss and debate Trotsky's ideas and positions. They felt that what Cannon called, quote, the vanguard of the vanguard, end quote, had to be thoroughly acquainted with the theories and notions of strategy and tactics of the man whom they regarded as the true representative of the great Bolshevik Revolution. During this period of introversion, the Trotskyists did little to seek to develop even modest influence in the labor movement. Thus, unlike the Lovestonites, they had no role in the organizing campaign and strikes which revived the International Ladies' Garment Workers Union in New York City in the early months of the New Deal in 1933. Even though their headquarters were close to the union's most important mass meetings. The state of affairs in the Communist League can be gauged from the report in the Militant concerning the Second National Conference of the organization in September 1931. It noted that delegations were present from branches in Toronto, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, St. Louis, Kansas City, and Minneapolis, and that other branches in Montreal, New Haven, and Richmond had not been able to afford to send delegates. This report commented on difficulties that had been overcome since the first conference almost 2 years before, noting that, quote, it cannot be denied that since the first conference, that is, during the early period following it, a certain organizational slump set in, which naturally also had its political repercussions. The center became greatly weakened, the necessary means for carrying on the work were seriously curtailed, and naturally the obstacles in the way contained elements of friction. One of the blows was expressed in the inability to continue the weekly publication of the Militant, which had begun in November 1928, Yet the great vitality of the organization, the power of the left opposition platform, made it possible to weather this period with only minor disorganization in a few branches. So much so that capitulations or actual loss of membership during these trying difficulties were exceedingly rare within our ranks, end quote. It was noted that, quote, the branches of Boston, Philadelphia, and St. Louis which had witnessed particular difficulties were reestablished, end quote. The second conference dealt with a political report submitted by Shachtman, a trade union discussion led by Arne Swabek, and relations with the international left opposition. A new central committee consisting of Martin Abern, James Cannon, Vincent Dunn, Albert Glotzer, Hugo Oehler, Max Shachtman, Karl Skoglund, Maurice Spector, and Arne Swabek was elected. The session was capped by a dinner at which, quote, a total of 150 plates were set and every place filled with comrades who came to give their enthusiastic endorsement, end quote. Some $207.13 was collected at the dinner, quote, for the future work of the League, end quote. Albert Glotzer has recorded that when he visited Trotsky a few weeks after this second conference of the CLA, quote, I informed him that the League had approximately 200 members, of which 165 were dues paying, I was able to report that the official journal of the League, the Militant, although no longer a weekly paper, had a printing of 3,000 copies, of which 2,000 copies circulated around the country, end quote. Albert Glotzer. First factionalism in the Trotskyist ranks. Although Cannon was unquestionably the senior figure in the ranks of the Trotskyist organization, there was considerable discontent with his leadership. Cannon's attention to his duties was sometimes sporadic. Mail went unanswered, and the newspaper sometimes did not get mailed out on time. Also, Cannon opposed moves to convert the Militant from a bi-weekly to a weekly, and for the Greek-speaking Trotskyists and the youth to publish their own periodicals. Late in 1929, Cannon disappeared entirely from group activities for 3 months, and when he returned, he offered no explanation for his absence. As a consequence of growing unhappiness about the way in which he was conducting the League's affairs, the first anti-Cannon faction was formed. This occurred in late 1929 or early 1930, and the group was headed by Shachtman, Abern, and Glotzer, then of Chicago. They finally decided early in 1930 to send Shachtman to Europe to make personal contact with Trotsky and explain to him this unsatisfactory state of affairs. This division in the ranks was only the first of several such crises that were to develop between Cannon and the group centering on Shachtman. This was to culminate a decade later in the definitive split between the two elements. On this occasion, the schism was soon healed, although in 1934 the Shachtman-Abern-Glotzer group again organized a bloc against Cannon. This new split was ended unilaterally when Shachtman once again mended fences with Cannon. There were undoubtedly several reasons for the early development of this division within U.S. Trotskyist ranks. One was certainly organizational in the sense that then and later Cannon was to seem sporadically uninterested in routine work, which complicated the problems of maintaining a stable organization. In addition, there were undoubtedly personality clashes. Cannon was substantially older than his critics. He was exceedingly proud of his working-class background and tended to see his opponents both in the days of the Communist Party and in the Trotskyist movement as, quote, New York intellectuals, end quote, resenting what he conceived to be their lack of knowledge of the, quote, reality, end quote, of U.S. working-class life. Certainly could say that about Trotsky, too, in my opinion. Not that that's a bad thing at all, but it's like, that's exactly what, never mind. There was certainly some truth in Cannon's analysis. Shachtman at least had an intellectual brilliance and capacity for theoretical exegesis and debate which Cannon lacked. In addition, Shachtman had a caustic wit, which he undoubtedly turned against Cannon when they disagreed. However, it was not until 1939 to 40 that any serious differences in principles developed between the two groups. The role of James P. Cannon. Many years later, when he was long out of the official Trotskyist movement, Shachtman tried to assess Cannon's role in the early years of the Trotskyist movement. Shachtman commented that, quote, the American Trotskyist movement was born with two distinct advantages, end quote. One of these was that it was formed only in 1928, by which time Trotsky had clearly developed his distinctive ideological position. The other was, quote, one derived from the acknowledged leader of the organization, ... in our case, from Cannon. We have listened to many attempts to ignore or deny this fact, but we never heard one of any merit, end quote. This advantage, according to Shachtman, was that, quote, Cannon gave the American Trotskyist movement a personal link with the preceding revolutionary movements and therewith helped to preserve the continuity of the movement, a factor disdained by the dilettante and inordinately worshipped by the bureaucrat, but nevertheless regarded as highly important and precious by any responsible militant, end quote. Shachtman noted that Cannon had been a significant younger leader of the IWW before World War I, had been one of the first supporters of the Bolshevik Revolution and led the fight against, quote, illegality, end quote, and had been the first chairman of the legal Communist Party. Furthermore, quote, from the beginning of the movement, he was outstanding and steady in his insistence that the organization would never amount to much unless it oriented itself primarily and mainly toward the proletariat, unless it rooted itself strong and deep in the organized labor movement, unless it became itself an overwhelmingly proletarian movement, end quote. Shachtman. Shachtman argued that while Cannon, quote, left far behind him the prejudices which most Wobblies carried as their distinguishing badge, he did not or could not free himself in reality from the worst of them, that corroding contempt for theory, end quote. Shachtman claimed that in the Trotskyist movement, quote, they expected their leaders to show a respect for Marxian theory that would be manifested in a knowledge of its historical development and an ability to employ that knowledge in dealing with problems of the day. Cannon had neither the knowledge nor the ability as well known to all his old friends and critics, but above all to himself, ... end quote, Shachtman. As a consequence of this situation, Shachtman claimed that, quote, Cannon choked off the potential for political development in literally dozens of comrades who came under his influence by instilling in them a disdainful attitude toward, quote, theory, end quote, theorizers, end quote, and, quote, intellectuals, end quote, in general. His insistence on a proletarian orientation for the movement, so incontestably right in and of itself, now as much as at the beginning, was subverted to the denigration of, quote, theorizers, end quote, and people, quote, abnormally, end quote, concerned with analyzing political and theoretical problems, end quote. Shachtman. Whether or not all of Shachtman's strictures on Cannon were entirely correct, it is clear that in many of his speeches and public papers, Cannon did tend to denounce, quote, theorizers and, quote, intellectuals. It is also almost certainly true that the perceptions of both Cannon and Shachtman and others concerning the respective role of the intellectual and ideological leader and the organizational chieftain were important sources of friction both in these early factional conflicts in the Communist League and in subsequently internal struggles within the ranks of U.S. Trotskyism. The evolution of U.S. Trotskyism. The first contacts with Trotsky. Max Shachtman's trip to Prinkipo early in 1930 was the first personal contact which his American followers had with Leon Trotsky, although there had been some previous correspondence. Prinkipo, if you don't know, was the first place that Trotsky was first deported to when he was kicked out of the Soviet Union. It's in Turkey, I believe. Yeah, it's in Turkey, let's say. I feel confident to say that it's in Turkey. I don't know why I'm feeling... I don't know if that's where it is now. I have to look it up. And I might even be pronouncing it wrong, too. Yeah, Turkey. Anyway, Max Shachtman's trip to Prinkipo early in 1930 was the first personal contact which his American followers had with Leon Trotsky, although there had been some previous correspondence. At the time of the expulsion of the Trotskyists from the CPUSA, they were unable to establish any direct contact with the Russian leader since he was in internal exile in Soviet Central Asia. However, early in 1929, Trotsky was expelled from the Soviet Union and began the first stage of his last exile by setting up residence in the island of Prinkipo in Turkey. Once Trotsky was out of the Soviet Union, his U.S. followers sought to establish contact. Cannon noted that, quote, I wrote him a letter. We soon received an answer, end quote, and added that, quote, thereafter, except for the time he was interned in Norway, until the day of his death, we were never without the most intimate contact with the founder and inspirer of our movement, end quote. Trotsky's reply to Cannon's first letter arrived before the founding convention of the Communist League of America in May 1929. Cannon noted that, quote, his answer, as all of his letters, as all of his articles, was permeated with political wisdom. His friendly advice helped us in solving our problems, end quote. Max Shachtman was only the first American Trotskyist to see Trotsky in Turkey. Among those who made the pilgrimage was Albert Glotzer, who went about a year after Shachtman's visit. He ended up staying for 2 months while Trotsky worked on his History of the Russian Revolution, for which he was under contract with an American publisher. The Weisbord Group. During these years, a second group in the United States sought affiliation with International Trotskyism. This was the Communist League of Struggle, headed by Albert Weisbord. Weisbord had been a Communist Party trade union leader of some importance in the 1920s. Weisbord was a Harvard graduate who had undertaken to organize the textile workers in the large Botany Mills plants in Passaic and Garfield, New Jersey. In the winter of 1925 to 26, the union which Weisbord had established called a strike. Weisbord had been jailed, all strike meetings had been banned, and socialist leader Norman Thomas had made a famous speech on the strikers' behalf in Garfield, which had brought his arrest too. Finally, mainly due to Thomas's influence, Weisbord was released, but the strike had been broken. 2 years later, Weisbord organized the National Textile Workers Union, the second of the, quote, dual unions, end quote, established by the Communists on directives from the Communist International. However, in 1929, Weisbord was expelled from the Communist Party. Although he apparently had some sympathy for Trotsky and his ideas, and the Communist League of America was already in existence, Weisbord did not join the CLA, but organized his own group. For several years, he sought to prove to Trotsky that the Communist League of Struggle was more Trotskyist than the CLA. The first exchange of correspondence between Weisbord and Trotsky appears to have occurred in late 1931. In reply to a letter from Weisbord, Trotsky sent a copy of his letter to the National Executive Committee of the CLA. Trotsky wrote, quote, "I cannot adopt your standpoint. Your criticism of the American League seems to me one-sided, artificial, and terribly exaggerated. You throw the League and the right wing together, which shows that you utterly disregard the fitness of things. You make fun of the publishing activity of the League and counterpose your, quote, mass action, end quote, to it. Have you any mass activity behind you? Before one turns to the masses, one must construct a principled basis. One begins as a propaganda group and develops in the direction of mass action," end quote. Weisbord persisted. In May 1932, he visited Trotsky and they had, quote, several talks, end quote. In a subsequent letter written to the CLS at Weisbord's request, Trotsky indicated the principal issue he thought separated that organization from International Trotskyism. Trotsky first mentioned the issue of working for the formation of a labor party in the United States, a position which Trotsky opposed at that time. He wrote that, quote, "On the question of the Labor Party, your organization is very close to Lovestone's, which is notoriously opportunistic, ... While taking or trying to take a Marxist position toward past events in other countries, you take an opportunist position toward future events in your own country. I believe that without a radical revision of your position on the central question of the party, an effective rapprochement between your organization and the international left opposition cannot be realized," end quote. Trotsky then cited another subject of disagreement, quote, "Up to now, your group has rejected our definition of the international Stalinist faction as bureaucratic centrism," end quote. He went on to chastise Weisbord and his friends for their attitude towards the Communist League. Quote, "To a considerable degree, your criticism of the American League starts from wrong premises, ... At the same time, you give your criticism a character so immoderate, exaggerated, and embittered that we are forced to view you as an ideological trend not in the camp of the international opposition, but of its adversaries, if not of its open enemies," end quote. Insofar as Weisbord's criticism that the CLA was not sufficiently involved in mass work was concerned, Trotsky rejoined, quote, "Let us admit for a minute that the American League lacks this or that possibility for mass work. I agree that your group would be able to complement the work of the American League in that respect. But mass work must be carried out on the basis of definite principles and methods. Until the necessary unanimity on a number of fundamental questions is attained, disputes on, quote, mass work, end quote, will inevitably remain fruitless," end quote. Trotsky. Finally, Trotsky told Weisbord that, quote, "You must keep clearly in mind that the road to the international left opposition leads through the American League. A second road does not exist. Unification with the American League is possible only on the basis of the unity of principles and methods which must be formulated theoretically and verified by experience," end quote. Negotiations did take place between the Communist League of America and the Communist League of Struggle. However, these discussions were suspended by the CLA in October 1932, and there is no indication that they were renewed. Weisbord finally gave up Marxism-Leninism altogether and became an American Federation of Labor organizer. The quote, "turn to the masses," end quote. During 1933, the Communist League of America substantially changed its orientation. Instead of talking largely to themselves and seeking to recruit on an individual basis from the Communist Party, they began to seek to propagate their ideas and to recruit new members to their ranks on a much wider basis. There were several reasons for this change. One was Trotsky's decision after the collapse of the German Communist Party in the face of the advent to power of the Nazi regime that the Comintern and its national parties could not be reformed. Trotsky's new orientation meant that the Trotskyist group should no longer consider themselves, quote, oppositions, end quote, but rather full-fledged rivals and competitors of the national communist parties, and that they should work towards establishing an alternative to the existing Stalinist-controlled international, a new and, quote, genuine, end quote, communist international. The renewed militancy of the organized labor movement starting in the early months of the New Deal was another factor contributing to the change in outlook and practice of the Trotskyists. For the first time, they saw an opportunity to assume some role in leading the workers who were rushing to organize both in the old unions of the American Federation of Labor and in more or less spontaneous new groups established outside the American Federation of Labor. Developments within other elements of the radical movement also stimulated the Trotskyists to change their strategy and tactics. On the one hand, the outbreak of violent factionalism within the Socialist Party, still the largest of the radical groups, encouraged not only the Trotskyists, but the Communists and Lovestonites to try to fish in the SP's troubled waters. At the same time, other new radical groups are appearing, the most significant of which, from the Trotskyist point of view, was the American Workers' Party, which A.J. Muste's Confederation for Progressive Labor Action had set about establishing. The change in orientation of the Trotskyists was reflected in various ways. For one thing, they began to publish The Militant 3 times a week. For another, they organized national tours for several party leaders, including Cannon, Shachtman, and Hugo Oehler. Oehler. In addition, they now began to try to establish contacts with elements in the Socialist Party and Young People's Socialist League, as well as within the Mustite group and even with the Lovestonites. The earliest serious involvement of the Trotskyists in organized labor took place in New York City, where in the latter part of 1933 there was a recrudescence of Hotel and Restaurant Workers Union. The Trotskyists had one member in that union who, quote, after years of isolation, ... suddenly found himself an influential figure, end quote. Another member of the Communist League, B.J. Field, described by Cannon as, quote, a man of many intellectual accomplishments, end quote, was sent into the union. Through his ability to speak French, he assumed leadership of a group of French chefs who were the union's backbone. Through their influence, he was chosen as union secretary. B.J. Field had been an early member of the Communist League. In 1932, Field had been expelled from the CLA because, by Trotsky's description of the case, quote, he disturbs the unity of the organization and threatens its ability to act, end quote. Field had then gone to Principe and stayed with Trotsky for some time. Trotsky clearly valued his capacities as an economist and statistician and had circulated throughout the international left opposition a document of Field's which Trotsky described as being, quote, an evaluation of the immediate cyclical tendencies of the world market, end quote. Trotsky. There had been some exchange of correspondence between the Communist League of America leadership and Trotsky concerning the latter's friendly treatment of Field. However, at the end of 1932, Field and his wife Esther had been the only Americans present at the informal conference of Trotsky with his followers during his short visit to Copenhagen. Upon Field's return to the United States, he was readmitted to the League and became an economic writer for the Militant. Early in 1934, the Hotel and Restaurant Workers Union declared a general strike of its members in New York City hotels and restaurants. Field led this strike, but the Trotskyists soon became upset by his failure to consult with the League on his conduct of the walkout. After remonstrating with him various times, the National Committee of the League finally expelled him from its ranks once again while the strike was still underway. The strike was finally resolved on a basis not very satisfactory to the Union. Once out of the Communist League, Field established an organization of his own, the League for a Revolutionary Workers' Party. It established fraternal contacts with a group of disaffected Canadian Trotskyists and for a while maintained a kind of international organization. The Fieldites continued to consider themselves as being broadly aligned with Trotskyism. At the time of the expulsion of the Trotskyists from the Socialist Party in 1937, the Fieldite paper Labor Front commented that, quote, as for the position of the League for a Revolutionary Workers' Party, our policy remains that what it has been, to approach such groups as the Trotskyites, with whom we have many things politically in common, with a view to practical collaboration and political discussion in order to test the possibilities of political agreement and of organizational merger, end quote. The Fieldites did not survive World War II. One notable event reflecting the new orientation of the Trotskyists after 1933 was their challenging J. Lovestone to a debate on whether there was a need for a new international, Cannon arguing in favor, while Lovestone supported the need to, quote, reform and unify the Communist International, end quote. The debate, held on March 5, 1934, was attended by more than 1,000 people, quote, the biggest audience that we had ever spoken to on a political issue since our expulsion, end quote, according to Cannon. The Minneapolis strike. Although the New York hotel workers' strike, the Trotskyist debut in trade union activity, did not result in any lasting gain in Trotskyist influence in organized labor, a series of walkouts of Teamsters in Minneapolis a few weeks later gave the Communist League its first real foothold in the trade union movement. This activity began with a strike in unionized coal yards led by a group of Trotskyites who were working there, which was quickly won by the workers. The success triggered a rapid general organizing campaign among the Teamsters of the city, led by an organizing committee made up in large part of members of the Communist League. Once they had a large percentage of the city's Teamsters organized, the Trotskyists and their colleagues in the organizing committee began planning for a general strike to force the employers to recognize the union, Local 574 of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. They established a strike headquarters equipped not only with a kitchen to serve the strikers and their families, but a dispensary staffed with a doctor and nurses to take care of strikers who might get hurt on the picket line. The first general Teamsters strike took place in May and lasted only 6 days. It was finally settled on the basis of employer recognition of the union, although no economic gains were made at that time, a fact which provoked strident Communist Party attacks on the Trotskyist leaders for having, quote, betrayed, end quote, the workers. However, the May general strike was only a prelude to a much more serious walkout 2 months later. When the newly recognized union presented collective bargaining demands, the Citizens Alliance, an open-shop employers organization of long standing, began to encourage resistance to the union's demands. On the other hand, the union, and particularly the Trotskyists of the organizing committee, mobilized the backing of the Central Labor Union of the local American Federation of Labor to support the Teamsters in their demands and did a new walkout should it occur. The second Teamsters general strike in Minneapolis began on July 16, 1934. This time the walkout lasted 5 weeks and became a fundamental showdown between the city's organized labor movement and the open shop employers who had long dominated Minneapolis. The leadership of the Communist League of America became very much involved in this walkout. In addition to giving it wide publicity in the militant and through other media, Max Shachtman and a sympathizer, Herbert Solow, were brought in to handle press relations on the spot. Albert Goldman was brought up from Chicago to serve as a general counsel for the strikers, and Hugo Oehler came from New York to organize the unemployed in support of the walkout. James Cannon was on hand to give general political advice to the Trotskyist strike leaders. Several of these people, as well as the Trotskyists among the strike leaders, participated in the negotiations with mediators sent in by the federal government, as well as with state officials. When Governor Floyd Olson finally declared martial law, Cannon and Shachtman were immediately arrested, and after being held overnight were, quote, exiled, end quote, to St. Paul across the Mississippi River, whence they continued to confer each evening with strike leaders. Another aid which the Trotskyists gave to the strike was the issuance of a special newspaper for the occasion, the Daily Organizer. Although it was distributed to anyone who asked for it, those taking copies were asked for a contribution, and this income largely financed the strike. After 5 weeks, the strike was finally ended with, quote, a settlement which was a substantial victory for the Union, end quote. This walkout established the leadership of the Trotskyists in Local 574 of the Teamsters, as well as assuring them for nearly a decade of a leading place in the organized labor movement in Minneapolis. This leadership, ironically, was to be the major cause for the persecution and prosecution of National Trotskyist leaders by the Roosevelt government during World War II. The Workers' Party of the United States. The formation of the Workers' Party. As part of its, quote, turn towards the masses, end quote, instead of concentrating its attention solely on recruiting individuals from the Communist Party, the Communist League developed contacts with, among other groups, the Conference for Progressive Labor Action, which early in 1934 had been converted into the American Workers' Party. Shortly, these contacts developed into serious discussions of the possibility of merging the two groups. The Conference for Progressive Labor Action was headed by a former Presbyterian minister, A.J. Muste, a pacifist of socialist orientation. In the 1920s and early 1930s, Muste had established and run the Brookwood Labor College in Westchester County, New York, an institution for training union officials and organizers which had enjoyed the support principally of unions under the influence of the Socialist Party. The Conference for Progressive Labor Action was first established as an arm of Brookwood to coordinate and give direction to practical training in the field for those who had studied at the college. Muste and those who were closest to him began in the early 1930s to develop their own political perspective. Unhappy with both the socialist and communist parties, they developed the thesis that there was need for a third radical party standing somewhere between the two major radical groups. This orientation brought them into particularly close contact with the Trotskyists. Clearly, so long as the Trotskyist self-perception was that of being, quote, opposition, end quote, communist, they had little sympathy for the orientation of the Mustites. However, once Leon Trotsky had decided that his followers should give up the idea of trying to reform the Comintern and its parties and try instead to establish a completely separate movement, there was ground for discussion with Muste and his followers. This was particularly true after Trotsky proclaimed the, quote, French turn, end quote, that is, the policy of entering socialist parties in various countries to capture them if that was feasible, and in any case to recruit as many new supporters from their ranks as possible. There is a difference of opinion among Trotskyists who participated in the merger with the Mustites as to whether this was seen by Trotsky's American followers as an application of the French term. Cannon clearly said of the French turn that, quote, "We translated it for America as an injunction to hasten the amalgamation with the American Workers' Party," end quote. Albert Gloucester, on the other hand, had argued that the merger with the AWP was not seen as an application of the French turn, but rather was entered into on the quite practical grounds that it would double the Trotskyist membership, and that both groups had had somewhat similar experiences in leading segments of the reviving organized labor movement. The Communist League of America in Minneapolis, and the Mustites in an important auto workers' strike at the Autolite plant in Toledo, Ohio. The American Workers' Party had been established by the Mustites early in 1934. Among other things, it called in its program for establishment of a new international, a position similar to that the Trotskyists had recently adopted. It was also highly critical of both the U.S. Socialist and Communist parties and the internationals to which they were affiliated. However, the AWP was a heterogeneous movement. It included elements such as Louis Bundenz and Arnold Johnson, who were leaning toward the Communist Party and joined it soon after the merger with the Trotskyists. There were trade union elements recruited in the Autolite strike and in the process of the Mustites' organization of a movement of the unemployed. There were such people as James Burnham, who were at the moment in agreement with the Trotskyists on most issues. There were also some trade union officials such as J.B.S. Hardman, J.B. Salutsky, editor of Advance, the newspaper of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, who were more socialist than Bolshevik. In spite of the different elements within the AWP, the Trotskyists were anxious to merge with it. They made such an offer in the summer of 1934. Then, after the conclusion of the Minneapolis Teamsters strike, they set out in earnest to bring about a merger. Cannon has noted that, quote, "We called on them to unite with us to form a new party to conquer the world. We've reopened negotiations with a letter of September 7th requesting the American Workers' Party to take a positive stand in favor of unification and appoint a committee to discuss with us the program and the organization details. This time we received a prompt reply from the American Workers' Party," end quote. The Trotskyists were more interested in getting a, quote, "correct," end quote, program for the new party than in the organizational arrangements within the new group. On the latter point, they proposed parity, both in the new National Committee and in the principal executive post in the new organization, for people coming from the Communist League and the American Workers' Party. After a number of bargaining sessions in which Muste, J.B. Salutsky, Sidney Hook, and James Burnham, among others, participated for the Mustites, and Cannon, Shachtman, Martin Abern, and Hugo Euler for the CLA. Agreement was reached. It was decided that each organization would hold its own national convention to ratify the new program and constitution of the Workers' Party, and then a joint convention would meet formally to establish the party. The first sessions were held from November 26th to 30th, 1934, and the founding convention of the Workers' Party met on December 1st to 2nd, 1934. After the Unification Convention, one more issue of each of the old group's newspapers, the Militant and Labor Action, was published, each with the slogan, quote, "For the Workers' Party of the United States," end quote. Each gave details on the convention of the CLA and the AWP and of the Unity Convention, and announced that the two publications would be succeeded by the New Militant. The Militant, in its account of the CLA convention, noted that Arne Swabeck had reported existence of 21 branches, quote, in the major industrial centers from the Atlantic to the Pacific, end quote. There were 43 delegates, and, quote, the composition of the delegates was overwhelmingly proletarian, many being deeply rooted in the trade union movement, end quote. The convention was principally concerned with Cannon's report, quote, on the international question, primarily the recent plenum of the International League to which he was a delegate, and the so-called, quote, French question, end quote, and with Shachtman's report on negotiations with the American Workers' Party for unity. Although debate on the Cannon report took 2 days, and, quote, a minority of comrades maintained that it was neither necessary nor correct to enter the French Socialist Party, end quote, the motion to endorse the resolution of the International Plenum was passed by, quote, an overwhelming majority, end quote. After a short discussion, the convention unanimously endorsed merger with the American Workers' Party. Labor Action noted that most of the debate of the American Workers' Party convention, at the American Workers' Party convention, preceding unity had dealt with the declaration of principles of the new Workers' Party. It also noted that, quote, because the American Workers' Party had no youth organization, it was decided that while youth members of the party were to be placed on the executive committee of the Spartacus Youth League, to become subsequently the youth organization of the new party, it would not be carried out on the 50-50 basis, end quote. Another article in Labor Action reported on the convention of the Spartacus Youth League, which met just after that of the Workers' Party. Some 38 delegates were in attendance, representing 250, quote, young workers, end quote, coming from New York, San Francisco, Chicago, Youngstown, Detroit, Philadelphia, and Canada. The article noted that, quote, fraternal delegates from the former American Workers' Party attended the convention and took an active part in the deliberations, end quote. Program of the Workers' Party. The name of Leon Trotsky was not mentioned in the Declaration of Principles and Constitution of the Workers' Party of the United States. On all essential issues, however, the program of the new party conformed to the ideas then held by the Trotskyists. It proclaimed that, quote, the Workers' Party of the United States is founded on the great principles of revolutionary theory and practice stated by Marx and Lenin and tested by the experience of the class struggle on an international scale, above all in the Russian Revolution of 1917, the, quote, October Revolution, end quote, end quote. The new party was to be, quote, Bolshevik, end quote, in organizational terms. The founding document proclaimed that, quote, every member is obligated to observe discipline and action. The administration of the party is centralized. Lower units are subordinate to the higher units. The National Committee, as the representative of the entire organization, elected at the convention, has full authority to act for the party and to enforce discipline of subordinate units, end quote. The Declaration of Principles proclaimed the need for the workers to, quote, take power and put an end to the destructive course of capitalist dictatorship, end quote. It further proclaimed that, quote, the fundamental mass instrument of this struggle for power forged in the course of united actions of the workers will be the workers' councils, Soviets, end quote. Furthermore, quote, the Revolutionary Party, likewise of necessity, leads the working class in the consolidation of its power after the victory, in the organization of socialist economy, in the suppression of internal counter-revolutionary elements, and in wars of the workers' states against capitalist states. The role of the party as the leader of the class continues until all forms of class organization, including the state and the party, are finally dissolved in the classless society." End quote. The Workers' Party also adopted the Trotskyist position on the USSR. It proclaimed, quote, "The Soviet Union is a worker state, product of the Russian Revolution, and beacon light of inspiration to the workers of the entire world, ... The unconditional defense of the Soviet Union against capitalist attack is an elementary duty of every worker, ... Fundamentally, this real defense of the Soviet Union depended not upon the League of Nations, non-aggression pacts, or any such measures, but upon successful workers' revolutions in other countries." End quote. Finally, the Trotskyist line on the need for a new international was proclaimed in the founding document of the Workers' Party. It read, quote, "A new, i.e., a fourth international, based on the theoretic and strategic principles laid down by Marx and Lenin, representing the historic continuity of the international revolutionary movement and applying these basic principles to the historical realities of the present stage of capitalist decline, must be built." End quote. It pledged to cooperate with any parties, quote, "which stand on the same fundamental program as our own, and to cooperate with them in the elaboration of a complete world program and the speediest possible establishment of the new international." End quote. Thanks for listening.